Grace and peace to you from the one who is, and who was, and who is to come. There's an urban legend that while serving as Commissioner of Patents, sometime between 1898 and 1901, that Charles Holland Dewell suggested closing the patent office, saying, everything that can be invented already has been invented. That idea to close the patent office seems to reflect an understanding that what we can see is all that will ever be. It seems to reflect a feeling that the ability to create has just about run its course. Of course, it's laughable now to look back on someone believing what he could see was all that would ever be at the dawn of the century that would bring us the airplane, antibiotics, and the computer, just to name a few. But that same mindset, what you can see is all that will ever be, was around long before that urban legend. The Sadducees were a group of people in Jerusalem who were closely tied to the temple. They accepted only the authority of the 5 books of Moses, those first 5 books of our Old Testament. They believed these books contained the complete revelation of God, and as such, that everything that could be created had been created. The God they believed in would not be up to anything new. So the notion of resurrection, of God creating new life beyond what they could see in the world as it was ludicrous to the Sadducees. The days leading up to his death and resurrection, the Sadducees asked Jesus a question about the resurrection, one they hoped would show the resurrection was completely ridiculous. They concoct a far-fetched scenario based on the commandment that if a man dies without children, his brother must marry the widow so she can have a child to continue the dead man's family line. They say the situation happened to a family with 7 brothers, and each of the 7 died without children. So, they ask, the woman then, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Jesus doesn't take the bait on the specifics of that commandment in question. For Jesus, what's at stake is far more crucial than how to fulfill a commandment people may not even have observed in his time. For Jesus, what's at stake is people believing they can set a limit on God's power to create because what they can see is all that will ever be. The Sadducees are setting a limit on God's power to create because they're assuming that any resurrection must be a revival and continuation of life as we know it. They believe what they can see is all that will ever be. What they see are laws God gave as a way to make do with the reality that we die, and that as a result of humankind's fall from grace in Eden, women were, and sometimes still are, at the mercy of the men in their lives. Neither of these realities were part of God's original dream for creation. But because they see the ways God's creation is broken, the Sadducees, who believe what they can see is all that will ever be, assume this brokenness must be reality for all time. If there is a resurrection, they believe it will have to look just like life the way they see around them, because they doubt God's ability to create anything new. Jesus does not agree. Jesus is the one who taught his disciples to pray, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," not "in heaven as it is on earth." Jesus understands that the life God promises is meant to shape the life we live now, not that the life we live now sets limits on the life God promises. Jesus understands that God still has the ability to create, and God can use that power in ways we have not yet seen, in ways we can't even imagine. Jesus, though, doesn't get very specific in describing the resurrection. He says those who are resurrected do not marry and are not given in marriage. He says those who are resurrected are like angels. They're children of God. He says that God is God of the living, not the God of the dead, because even those who have died are alive to God. I don't know about you, but what Jesus says doesn't help me draw a much more detailed picture of life in the resurrection. When I do try to imagine life in the resurrection, I find that my inner Sadducee starts to come out. If my idea of life and the resurrection is basically a bigger, better, longer version of something I know now, I'm putting a limit on God's ability to create. I'm deciding that what I see is all that can ever be, even if it's a bigger, better version of what I see. It's one thing to let what I already know put a limit on what I think God is going to do in the life to come. God is going to shape the resurrection however God wants, no matter what I think is possible or not. The grace in this is that God will offer us that resurrection life as a free gift given in love, no matter how wrong we might be in how we imagine that life. But our inner Sadducee creates a much bigger problem when it tries to convince us that all we see is all that can ever be for the world we live in now. That lack of faith in God's promise of the resurrection can keep us from participating in God's mission to bring that resurrection life into the world here and now. We might think, there have always been hungry people, so there always will be. What we see is all that can ever be, so why bother trying to feed these hungry people? This is our inner Sadducee coming out. But we're not Sadducees. As people who believe in the resurrection, we trust that God can create ways to feed the hungry we can't even imagine yet. When we do help feed the hungry, we're joining God's mission in bringing resurrection life into the world. We might think, this conflict or that conflict has always been going on, so it always will go on. What we see is all that will ever be, so why bother trying to be peacemakers? This too is our inner Sadducee coming out. But we're not Sadducees. As people who believe in the resurrection, we trust that God can create ways to bless the peacemakers that we can't even imagine yet. When we answer Jesus' call to be peacemakers that the Spirit gives us the ability, we're joining God's mission and bringing resurrection life into the world here and now. Or maybe most often we think, our country, or our neighborhood, or our church used to look like this, and that's the only way it can be. What we see when we look back to the past is all that can ever be. So why bother trying to see God at work in what's new? This is most certainly our inner Sadducee coming out. But we, brothers and sisters, are not Sadducees. As people who believe in the resurrection, we trust that God can create, and God can recreate community in places and in ways we can't even imagine yet. When we seek God's guidance about how to be faithful as things change around us, we're joining God's mission and bringing resurrection life to the world here and now. That promise of the resurrection is certainly a message of hope that God will raise all of creation to new life sometime in the future. But resurrection isn't just something God's going to do someday we don't know about yet. God can and does use this resurrection power to create new life here and now. As people who strive to be devoted disciples of Jesus Christ, we're called to work alongside God in doing resurrection work here and now. And if we want to let God work through us to bring that resurrection life into the world, we need to be open to the possibility of God creating new life that may or may not look like what we already know. Well, it's an urban legend that Charles Holland Duell suggested closing the patent office. Something he really did say is closer to the truth. In 1902, he wrote, "In my opinion, all previous lines of invention are going to appear totally insignificant when compared to those which the present century will witness. I almost wish I might live my life over again to see the wonders which are at the threshold." He recognized that what we can see is only a fraction of what will ever be. This is the message of the resurrection Jesus gives us today. God's power to create goes far beyond what we can already see and what we already know. This is a word of hope for an age to come, but even more importantly, It's a word of hope for the world we live in now. God's power to resurrect, to raise up new life, is at work today. It's at work each and every time one of God's people creates a way for life to grow and flourish. And it isn't bound by the idea that what we can see is all that will ever be. Jesus doesn't answer all our questions about the resurrection life God has promised to create. But he does give us the good news that our God is the God of the living, the God who raises us to new life now, the God who promises us that resurrection life to come. Thanks be to God.